The scream came from the north tower, before the sun had even risen, and Elira Hartwell dropped the basket of wet linens onto the stone floor and ran. She did not know why her feet carried her toward danger instead of away from it. Every other servant in the fortress was running the opposite way, pale faces and shaking hands, whispering that the king had returned from the border in a rage no one had ever seen before. Elira pushed through the narrow servant corridor, her heart hammering, and reached the courtyard just as Alpha King Ronan Blackthorn slammed his fist into the stone wall hard enough to crack it. He was breathing like something wounded, his broad shoulders heaving under a torn black coat, his eyes flickering gold and then dark, and then gold again, a sign that his wolf was fighting to break free. Guards stood frozen at a distance, none of them brave enough to approach. Elira had seen him from afar many times, in 3 years of service, always composed, always cold. A king who spoke in short commands and never raised his voice. This was a different man. Or perhaps, she thought with a shiver, this was the truest version of him. "Get back," barked Captain Callum Ashford, catching sight of her. "Now, girl." But Elira did not move. She was not sure why. Something about the way the king's hands trembled, something about the raw pain behind his fury, rooted her feet to the ground. He turned toward her, gold eyes locking onto hers, and for one long moment the courtyard fell utterly silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, as quickly as it had come, the storm in him receded. His shoulders dropped. His eyes faded back to a tired, ordinary brown. He looked at Elira as though seeing her for the first time, though she had washed his linens for 3 years without him ever learning her name. "Leave," he said quietly, and this time she obeyed, though the image of him stayed with her long after she returned to the laundry hall. By mid-morning, the fortress had returned to its usual rhythm, as though the scene in the courtyard had never happened. Elira scrubbed a shirt against the washboard, her mind still replaying the king's eyes. Nora Fenwick, the older laundress who had trained her since she first arrived as an orphaned exile, nudged her with an elbow. "You are somewhere else today," Nora said, not unkindly. "Thinking about the king's temper?" "I am thinking about how tired my arms are," Elira lied, and Nora laughed, letting the subject drop. Elira had come to the Blackthorn Fortress 3 years earlier, after her family's small pack was disbanded and scattered following a border dispute that stripped them of land and title. Her father, Edwin Hallow, had once been a respected pack elder, but after his death, Elira and her mother Marla had nowhere else to go. Marla found work in the kitchens before her health failed, and Elira took up laundry duty to support them both. It was humble work, but it was steady, and steady was something Elira had learned to be grateful for. She rarely thought about the king except when his temper became fortress gossip, which was often. He was known as a fair ruler in matters of law, generous with his people in times of hardship, but utterly closed in matters of the heart. No mate had ever been named. No courtship had ever been rumored. Some servants whispered that his wolf had rejected every candidate presented by the pack council. Others said the king simply did not believe in love, that duty had hollowed him out long before he took the throne. That afternoon, a steward named Osric Vane arrived at the laundry hall, with an armful of garments still dusty from the road. Among them was the king's ceremonial robe, deep midnight blue with silver embroidery along the collar, the one he wore only for pack council meetings and formal declarations. It had returned from the border campaign stained with mud, and something darker that Elira did not want to name. "His Majesty wants it clean and ready by tomorrow evening," Osric said, dropping the bundle onto the table without ceremony. "There is a council meeting, do not delay." Nora eyed the robe with a slight frown. "That fabric is delicate. It needs careful handling, not rushed handling." "Then handle it carefully and quickly," Osric said, already walking away. Elira lifted the robe once he had gone, running her fingers over the embroidered collar. It was heavier than she expected, the fabric rich and dense, clearly tailored by skilled hands. She began the careful process of checking every seam before washing, a habit Nora had taught her since delicate garments could tear if handled the wrong way. As she smoothed the inner lining flat against the table to check for damage, her fingers brushed against something unusual, a slight ridge where the fabric should have lain flat. She paused. Most robes had a single layer of lining, but this one seemed to have a second hidden layer stitched beneath the first, so subtly done that only careful hands would notice the extra thickness. Curiosity, which had gotten Elira into trouble more than once during her childhood, pulled at her now. She glanced around. Nora had stepped out to fetch more soap from the storeroom, and the hall was empty. Elira should have left it alone. She told herself this even as her fingers found the small opening where the inner stitching had come slightly loose, likely from the same rough campaign that had stained the fabric in the first place. She should have simply noted the tear and moved on to mending it. Instead, she slipped 2 fingers into the gap and felt paper. Her breath caught. She pulled gently, and a folded piece of parchment slid free, followed by another, and another. There were perhaps a dozen letters altogether, tucked into the hidden lining of the king's most formal garment, hidden so carefully that no laundress before her had ever found them, or if they had, none had dared to look further. She knew she should stop. She knew that whatever these letters were, they belonged to the king, and reading them would be a violation of trust that could cost her far more than her position. But her hands, disobedient and curious, had already unfolded the first one before her mind caught up with her actions. As the handwriting was uneven, pressed hard into the parchment as though the writer's hand had shaken while forming the words. It was nothing like the elegant formal script the king used on official proclamations that were sometimes read aloud in the courtyard. This was rougher, more urgent, the words of someone writing not for an audience but for release. "I do not know why I write these words when I know they will never be sent," the letter began. "Perhaps it is because keeping this silence inside me is heavier than any crown. My wolf does not sleep anymore. It paces through every quiet hour, restless, aching for something I have refused to name even to myself. I am told that a king does not need love, that duty is enough to fill a life. I have believed this for years. But tonight, watching her from a distance, doing something as ordinary as carrying water across the courtyard, my wolf nearly broke free from my control entirely. I have never felt anything like it before." Elira's hands trembled as she read. She glanced toward the doorway, listening for Nora's footsteps, and heard nothing but the distant clatter of the fortress kitchens. She should fold the letter back up. She should pretend she had never found it. Instead, she reached for the second letter, driven by a need to understand what she had stumbled into. The second letter was shorter, written in the same urgent hand, though the ink looked slightly different, perhaps written on another night entirely. "She does not know I exist beyond the tasks she performs," the letter read. "That is safer for both of us. If she knew what my wolf feels when she is near, she would run from this fortress and never return, and rightly so. A servant deserves a life of her own choosing, not a crown's shadow pressing down on her. And yet I cannot make my wolf let go of this feeling. It is chosen, and I do not know how to unchoose what a wolf has already claimed." Elira set the letter down slowly, her pulse loud in her own ears. The words were not signed with the king's name. Instead, at the bottom of each letter, in the same trembling hand, was a single phrase. Written by the wolf, not the king. She sat frozen at the table, the letters spread before her like pieces of a puzzle she had not asked to solve. Somewhere in the fortress, a bell rang to mark the hour, and the sound startled her back into motion. She gathered the letters quickly, her mind racing, uncertain whether to hide them again exactly as she had found them, or to bring them to someone, though she could not imagine who that someone would be. Telling anyone that she had gone through the king's private lining would be foolish at best, and dangerous at worst. Nora's footsteps sounded in the corridor, and Elira shoved the letters into the small leather pouch she wore at her waist for carrying pins and thread, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it must be visible through her dress. Nora entered carrying a fresh bar of soap, humming quietly to herself, utterly unaware of what had just happened at the table beside her. "You look pale," Nora said, setting the soap down. "Are you unwell?" "Just tired," Elira said, forcing a small smile. "I did not sleep well." Nora accepted this without question, and together, they returned to the task of washing the robe, though Elira's mind was no longer on the fabric in her hands. It was on the words she had read, words written by a king who signed himself as something else entirely, words that spoke of a servant he watched from a distance, a servant whose presence nearly broke his control. She told herself it could not be her. There were dozens of women who served in the fortress, cooks and maids and stable hands, any one of whom the king might have noticed in passing. It was foolish, even dangerous, to imagine that the king of the Blackthorn pack, a man who had never so much as looked directly at her in 3 years, had been secretly writing about her in hidden letters sewn into his own robe. And yet, as she worked the fabric clean that evening, she could not stop replaying the moment in the courtyard, The way his gold eyes had found hers and held there. The way the fury in him had softened the instant he saw her face. She could not stop wondering, against every instinct of caution she had built over years of careful, invisible service, whether the letters had been about her all along. By the time she finished washing and pressing the robe, the fortress had gone quiet with evening, and Alira carried the finished garment toward the steward's chamber, to deliver it herself, her mind still tangled in questions she did not know how to answer, and the folded letters still hidden against her waist, waiting to be read again. The steward's chamber was empty when Alira arrived, so she left the pressed robe draped over a wooden stand exactly as she had been instructed, then hurried back through the corridors toward the servants' quarters, her heart still racing from the discovery she carried against her waist. She had meant to leave the letters behind, tucked back into the hidden lining where she had found them. She had told herself this while walking to the steward's chamber, yet her hands had not obeyed. The letters remained folded inside her small pouch, and she did not fully understand why she could not part with them. Her shared room with Nora was small but private enough at this hour, since Nora had gone to visit her sister in the lower village for the evening. Alira lit a single candle, sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and pulled the letters free once more. There were more than she had first realized, perhaps 14 in total, some faded with age, others written on parchment so fresh the ink barely looked dry. Whoever had written these had been writing for years, not weeks. She unfolded a letter near the bottom of the stack, one clearly older than the rest, the parchment slightly yellowed at the edges. 3 years now since she arrived at this fortress, the letter began, and still my wolf has not forgotten the moment she first crossed the gate. She was frightened and proud at once, refusing to let anyone see her cry, despite everything she had lost. I remember thinking that a person who could hold herself with such quiet dignity, after losing everything, deserved a life far better than the one circumstance had given her. I told myself then that admiration was harmless. I did not yet understand how wrong I was. Alira's breath caught. 3 years. That matched precisely the length of her own service in the fortress. She had arrived exhausted and grieving, having just buried her father, and watched her mother's health decline from the stress of their exile. She remembered crossing the gate with her chin lifted, refusing to let the guards see her weep, though inside she had felt entirely hollow. She reached for another letter, hands shaking slightly now. Today she carried water across the courtyard while laughing at something the older laundress said. The letter read. I do not know what amused her, but the sound of it stayed with me the rest of the day. My advisors speak endlessly of alliances and succession, yet none of their words linger in my mind the way her laughter did. I am beginning to fear that my wolf has already decided something my crown cannot allow. Alira set the letter down and pressed her palm against her chest, willing her heart to slow. She thought of every small interaction she could recall over the years, moments she had barely registered at the time. The king pausing near the laundry hall entrance on his way to the training yard, always for a few seconds longer than necessary. The king once catching a falling basket of linens before it struck the ground, his hand brushing hers for the briefest instant, before he walked away without a word. She had thought nothing of these moments then, dismissing them as coincidence, because it had never once occurred to her that a king might notice a laundress at all. Now, sitting in the candlelight with proof spread across her lap, she did not know what to feel. Fear rose first, sharp and immediate. If anyone discovered she had found these letters, she could be accused of theft, or worse, of manipulating her way toward the king's attention for some selfish gain. Servants had been dismissed from the fortress for far smaller offenses. And beneath the fear sat something else entirely, something warmer and more dangerous, a small flicker of hope she did not want to examine too closely. A knock sounded at the door, and Alira startled so violently that she nearly knocked the candle from its holder. She swept the letters beneath her blanket, just as Nora's voice called from the hallway. Alira, are you awake? I forgot my key. Alira opened the door, forcing her expression calm, and let Nora inside. The older woman glanced at her curiously. You look flushed, Nora said, setting down her shawl. Did something happen while I was away? Nothing important, Alira said, the lie coming easier this time, though guilt twisted uncomfortably in her stomach. Nora had been kind to her since the day she arrived, teaching her every trick of the trade, defending her against the sharper tongues among the household staff. Lying to her felt wrong, yet Alira could not imagine how to explain what she had found without sounding either delusional or dangerously indiscreet. That night, long after Nora had fallen asleep, Elira lay awake staring at the ceiling, the letters hidden beneath her mattress now instead of her waist pouch, safer there, she hoped, from prying eyes. She thought about returning them to the Robe before the king noticed anything missing, sneaking into the steward's chamber before dawn, to slip them back into the hidden lining, as though she had never touched them. But another part of her, quieter and more insistent, wondered what would happen if she did not. The following morning brought fresh urgency to her decision. Word spread through the fortress kitchens that the king intended to wear the ceremonial robe again that very evening for the pack council meeting, the same meeting Osric Vane had mentioned the day before. If the letters were missing from the lining when he dressed, he would know immediately that someone had found them, and there would be no way to undo the discovery. Elira spent the morning in a fog of anxious calculation, scrubbing garments without truly seeing them, her mind circling the same impossible choice. Return the letters and risk him noticing the tier had been reopened and resealed. Keep them and risk him searching for them and eventually suspecting her, since she was the last person known to have handled the robe. At midday, while carrying a basket of clean linens toward the drying yard, she nearly collided with Captain Callum Ashford, who caught the basket before it toppled and steadied her with a firm hand on her shoulder. "Careful there," he said, his tone easy despite his imposing size. Callum had served as the king's personal guard captain for as long as Elira had lived in the fortress, and unlike many of the higher household staff, he had always treated the servants with basic courtesy. "You seem distracted today." "Apologies, Captain," Elira said, straightening the basket. "I did not sleep well." Callum studied her for a moment longer than necessary, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly, as though he sensed something beneath her words that did not quite fit. But he said nothing further, simply nodded, and continued on his way, leaving Elira to release a breath she had not realized she was holding. By evening, she had made her decision. She would return the letters, all of them, exactly as she had found them, before the council meeting began. It was the only path that did not lead toward disaster, or so she told herself. She waited until the fortress quieted into its evening rhythm, when most of the household staff gathered for the servants' meal, and slipped instead toward the steward's chamber, where the robe still hung on its wooden stand, freshly pressed and waiting. Her hands trembled as she lifted the fabric and located the small opening in the lining. She had brought needle and thread, intending to slip the letters back inside and stitch the seam closed, as though it had never been disturbed. She had just begun easing the first letter back into place when the chamber door opened behind her without warning, and she turned to find herself facing the very man the letters had been written about, standing in the doorway with an expression she could not read at all. Elira froze completely, the half-stitched letter still pinched between her fingers, her back pressed against the wooden stand as though she could somehow disappear into the fabric behind her. King Ronan Blackthorn stood in the doorway, still dressed in his training clothes, a light sheen of sweat on his brow suggesting he had come directly from the yard, rather than from any formal duty. His eyes moved first to her face, then to the robe behind her, then to the small folded paper visible in her trembling hand. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them spoke. Elira's mind raced through every possible explanation she could offer, none of them believable, none of them anything close to the truth. She was certain her face had gone pale as parchment, certain that guilt was written plainly across every feature. "I was mending the lining," she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a tear in the fabric from the campaign. I did not want it to spread before tonight's meeting." It was not entirely a lie, though it was far from the whole truth. She held her breath, waiting for him to demand the paper in her hand, waiting for the fury she had witnessed in the courtyard days earlier to return and consume her. Instead, something unexpected crossed his expression. Not anger, but a flicker of something closer to fear, quickly masked beneath practiced composure. His gaze lingered on the paper for a beat longer, and Elira instinctively closed her fingers around it, hiding it fully from view, though she suspected he had already seen enough to know exactly what it was. "Leave the mending to the tailor next time," he said finally, his voice tight and controlled. "The robe requires delicate handling. I would not want it damaged further." "Yes, Your Majesty," Elira said, bowing her head, relief and confusion tangling together inside her chest. He lingered a moment longer than the situation required, his eyes searching her face, as though looking for something specific, some sign of recognition or understanding. Elira kept her gaze lowered. afraid that if their eyes met again, as they had in the courtyard, she would lose whatever fragile composure she had managed to hold together. Finally, without another word, he turned and left the chamber, his footsteps retreating quickly down the corridor. Alira exhaled shakily and pressed a hand against the wooden stand to steady herself. He had not confronted her directly, had not demanded she hand over what she held. Yet something in his expression told her he knew, or at least suspected, that she had discovered far more than a simple tear in the lining. She quickly finished stitching the letters back into place, her hands clumsy with adrenaline, and smoothed the fabric until no trace of disturbance remained visible. That night, sleep did not come easily. Alira lay awake, replaying the moment in the steward's chamber over and over, searching for meaning in every flicker of his expression. If he had truly written those letters about her, surely he would have reacted differently upon finding her holding one. He would have been furious, or desperate, or at the very least, curious enough to ask what she had read. Instead, he had simply told her to leave the mending to the tailor and walked away, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Perhaps, she reasoned, the letters were not about her after all. Perhaps she had simply built an elaborate fantasy from a handful of coincidences and a king's private grief over some other woman entirely. Someone from his past that Alira knew nothing about. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it left her strangely hollow. Over the following days, Alira noticed a shift in the fortress that she could not immediately explain. The king, who had always kept his distance from the servant quarters, began appearing near the laundry hall with unusual frequency, always with some plausible reason for his presence, inspecting the drainage system near the courtyard, or speaking briefly with Captain Callum about training schedules that could easily have been discussed elsewhere. Each time, his eyes would find Alira across the yard, hold for a moment, then quickly move away, as though he had not meant to look at all. Nora noticed it too, though she attributed it to entirely different causes. "The king has been unusually present lately," she remarked one afternoon while folding a stack of towels. "Perhaps he is preparing new regulations for the household staff." "Perhaps," Alira agreed, though she suspected the truth had nothing to do with regulations. One afternoon, while hanging linens along the drying lines behind the laundry hall, Alira felt a presence behind her, and turned to find the king standing several paces away, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Majesty," she said, startled, quickly setting down the linen she had been holding, and offering a proper bow. "I did not mean to startle you," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it directed at anyone in the fortress. "I was simply passing through." She glanced around the empty drying yard, noting that his path here required a considerable detour from anywhere he might reasonably need to be. She said nothing of this observation, choosing instead to remain silent and wait for him to either explain himself or leave. "The robe," he said after a moment, his eyes flicking briefly toward the fortress behind them. "Was it damaged badly? The lining, I mean." Alira's heart skipped. This was the closest he had come to directly acknowledging what had happened in the steward's chamber. She chose her words carefully. "A small tear, Your Majesty. Nothing that could not be repaired." "Good," he said, though his tone suggested the answer had not fully satisfied whatever question he was truly asking. He studied her for a long moment, his gold-flecked eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her skin warm, despite the cool afternoon air. "You have served this household for 3 years now." It was not a question, yet it startled her all the same. "Yes, Your Majesty, since I was 16. "I remember," he said quietly, and then, as though catching himself revealing too much, he straightened abruptly and cleared his throat. "See that the drying lines are reinforced before the next storm season. The old rope will not hold." "Of course, Your Majesty," Alira said, though her mind was still catching on the words he had spoken before. "I remember." Spoken with a weight that suggested memories reaching back far further than a simple record of her hiring date. He left without further explanation, and Alira stood alone in the drying yard for several minutes afterward, the wind tugging at the linens around her, her thoughts a tangled mess of hope and disbelief. She thought of the letters hidden in the robe's lining, of a wolf that had noticed her the day she arrived at the gate, frightened and proud and grieving. She thought of laughter she barely remembered sharing with Nora years ago, laughter that apparently a king had overheard and carried with him since. It was becoming harder to convince herself that the letters belonged to some other woman entirely. Yet believing they were about her brought its own kind of danger, a hope she could not afford to nurture, not when the distance between a servant and a king remained as vast and unbridgeable as it had always been. Pack law was clear on such matters. A king's mate required council approval. Noble lineage was preferred, though not strictly required. And even in cases where a wolf's bond overruled such preferences, the pack council held considerable power to challenge or delay a union they found unsuitable. Illyra reminded herself of these facts, often over the following week, using them like a shield against the growing warmth she felt whenever their paths crossed. Yet no amount of reasoning could stop the small, stubborn flutter in her chest each time the king's gold-flecked eyes found hers, across a courtyard or hallway, lingering just a moment too long before duty pulled him elsewhere. A fortnight passed, and Illyra found herself watching the king with an attentiveness she had never allowed herself before. She noticed the way his shoulders tensed whenever Lady Priscilla Vane, daughter of the steward Osric Vane, approached him during council gatherings, the way his answers to her turned clipped and formal, nothing like the softer tone he had used in the drying yard. Priscilla had long been rumored among the household staff to be the pack council's preferred candidate for the king's mate, a noblewoman of proper lineage whose family held considerable influence over the eastern territories. "She has set her sights on the crown for years," Nora murmured to Illyra one evening as they folded linens together, nodding subtly toward a window that overlooked the courtyard where Priscilla stood, speaking animatedly with several council elders. Her father would very much like to see her wearing a queen's circlet before the year is through. Illyra said nothing, though she felt an unfamiliar tightness form in her chest at the sight of Priscilla's confident posture, her elegant gown, her easy familiarity with the men who held power over the entire pack. Whatever fragile hope had begun to bloom in Illyra over the past weeks suddenly felt foolish and small against the reality of what a king's marriage actually required. Priscilla was everything Illyra was not: high-born, educated, connected to influential families across the territory. A laundress with an exiled father and a mother too ill to work could never hope to compete, even if a wolf's bond claimed otherwise. That evening, unable to quiet her restless thoughts, Illyra retrieved the letters from beneath her mattress once more, reading through several she had not yet examined closely. One, dated only weeks earlier, caught her attention immediately. "The council pushes harder each week for me to name Priscilla Vane as my intended," the letter read. "Her father grows impatient, reminding me at every opportunity of the alliance her family could bring to our eastern borders. I have delayed as long as reason allows, offering excuses about focusing on the war effort, about needing more time to consider the matter properly. The truth is far simpler, and far more complicated than any excuse I have given. My wolf will not accept her. It growls low in my chest every time she draws near, a warning I have learned never to ignore, though I cannot explain its true cause to anyone, least of all to myself." Illyra read the letter twice, her pulse quickening with a mixture of relief and renewed uncertainty. If the king's wolf rejected Priscilla so completely, then perhaps the pull he felt toward someone else, whoever that someone might be, ran deeper than mere admiration. Yet the letter still did not name her directly, and Illyra forced herself to remember that certainty built on hope was a dangerous foundation. The following morning, fortress gossip buzzed with fresh news. Priscilla Vane had requested a private audience with the king, and rumor suggested her father intended to formally propose a betrothal agreement before the pack council that very week, hoping to force the king's hand through political pressure rather than patience. Illyra heard the news while delivering fresh linens to the upper hallways, and felt an unexpected wave of dread settle over her. She told herself it was not her concern. Whatever happened between the king and Priscilla Vane had nothing to do with a laundress who had no place in matters of succession or alliance. Yet as she carried the linens back toward the servants' quarters, she found herself pausing near a partially open door leading to one of the smaller council chambers, drawn by the sound of raised voices within. "The alliance with the eastern territories cannot wait indefinitely, Your Majesty," came Osric Vane's voice, tight with barely restrained frustration. "My daughter has waited patiently for 2 years now. The council grows restless, and restlessness among the elders leads to instability across the entire pack." "I am aware of the political realities, Osric," Ronan's voice answered, controlled but firm. "I have not forgotten my responsibilities to this pack." "Then name her," Osric pressed. "The bond between an alpha and his intended does not always arrive as thunder and lightning. Sometimes it grows through partnership, through shared purpose. Perhaps you simply need to give it time to develop naturally. There was a long pause before Ronan spoke again, and Alira found herself holding her breath outside the door, aware that she should move along before someone discovered her lingering, yet unable to make herself leave. A wolf's bond does not develop on command, Osric, Ronan said finally, his voice quieter now, almost weary. Mine has already chosen. I cannot force it to choose differently, no matter how convenient that might be for the council's political calculations. Alira's breath caught sharply in her throat. Osric's response came swift and sharp with disbelief. Chosen? Chosen whom, Your Majesty? If there is another candidate, the council deserves to know her name so that proper arrangements can be considered. There will be no announcement today, Ronan said, his tone closing the subject entirely. This audience is finished, Osric. Alira hurried away from the door before she could be discovered, her mind spinning with what she had overheard. He had chosen. His wolf had already chosen someone, and he refused to name her to the council, which suggested either that the woman was entirely unsuitable in the council's eyes, or that he feared what might happen to her if her identity became known before he was ready to protect her properly. Neither possibility eased Alira's growing unease. If she truly was the woman his wolf had chosen, then revealing her identity to a council, already pressuring him toward Priscilla Vane, could bring nothing but danger, resentment from powerful families, accusations of manipulation, or worse, perhaps even threats to her safety, or her mother's well-being. That evening, Alira visited her mother in the small cottage the fortress provided for retired staff on the outskirts of the grounds. Marla Hartwell had grown frail over the past year, her once strong hands now thin and trembling, though her mind remained as sharp as ever. You seem troubled, Marla said, as Alira helped her settle into her chair by the fire. More troubled than usual. Alira hesitated, uncertain how much to share. Her mother had always been her closest confidant, the one person who had never judged her for the family's fall from standing, who had taught her that dignity did not depend on titles or land. Finally, unable to carry the weight alone any longer, Alira told her mother everything, the letters, the hidden lining, the moment in the steward's chamber, the strange encounters in the drying yard, the conversation she had overheard outside the council chamber. Marla listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. When Alira finished, her mother reached out and took her hand with surprising strength. Your father once told me something I have never forgotten, Marla said quietly. He said that a wolf's bond does not care for titles or lineage, or the approval of councils. It cares only for truth. If this king's wolf has truly chosen you, no amount of political pressure will change that truth, though it may take considerable courage from both of you to see it recognized. And if I am wrong? Alira asked, voicing the fear that had haunted her for weeks. If I have built an entire fantasy from a handful of coincidences, then you will have lost nothing but a fantasy, Marla said gently. But if you are right, and you allow fear to keep you silent, you may lose something far more precious than pride. Alira left her mother's cottage that night, with her thoughts no clearer than before, yet something in her had shifted. She could no longer pretend the letters meant nothing, could no longer dismiss the growing certainty that whatever bond the king's wolf had formed, it had formed around her. The question that remained was what to do with that certainty, and whether she possessed the courage her mother believed she did. 3 days later, Priscilla Vane cornered Alira in the narrow passage behind the kitchens, her silk skirts brushing against the stone walls, her expression carrying none of the polished grace she displayed in public gatherings. Alira had been carrying a basket of pressed shirts toward the upper hallway, when Priscilla stepped directly into her path, blocking the only way forward. I have noticed something curious, Priscilla said, her voice smooth but edged with something sharper beneath the surface. The king has taken an unusual interest in the laundry hall these past weeks. Perhaps you can explain why. I could not say, my lady, Alira answered carefully, keeping her eyes lowered as propriety demanded, though her heart had begun racing at the directness of the accusation. Could you not? Priscilla stepped closer, close enough that Alira could smell the expensive perfume clinging to her gown. I have served this pax nobility since childhood, and I know how servants operate. Ambitious girls find ways to draw attention. Small glances held a moment too long. Tasks performed just close enough to a lord's path to seem accidental. I wonder which tricks you have employed. I have done nothing but my assigned duties, Alira said, lifting her chin, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Whatever fear she carried, she would not allow this woman to paint her as some conniving schemer when she had done nothing but exist in the same fortress for 3 years. Priscilla's eyes narrowed, studying Elira's face with open suspicion. The council has waited 2 years for the king to name his intended. 2 years, while I have conducted myself with every propriety expected of a future queen. I will not allow some laundress with delusions of grandeur to undermine an alliance this pact desperately needs. Do you understand me? I understand that you are frightened, Elira said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them, born of exhaustion and cornered nerves, rather than any calculated strategy. Perhaps that fear is worth examining, rather than directing at someone who has never sought anything from the king. Priscilla's face flushed with anger, and for a moment Elira feared she had gone too far. But instead of an outburst, Priscilla simply straightened her spine and stepped back, her expression cooling into something colder and more dangerous than open fury. Careful, girl, Priscilla said softly. Fortresses like this one have long memories for those who overstep their station. I would hate to see something unfortunate happen to a servant with no family of standing to protect her. She swept past Elira without another word, her skirts trailing across the stone floor, leaving Elira standing alone in the narrow passage with her basket of shirts and a racing heart. The threat had been unmistakable, however carefully veiled in polite phrasing. Elira understood now that whatever was happening between herself and the king, whatever his wolf had chosen, it had not gone unnoticed by those with the most to lose from such a bond. She said nothing of the encounter to Nora, unwilling to burden her friend with a danger that felt increasingly personal and impossible to explain fully. Instead, she threw herself into her work over the following days, hoping that quiet diligence might somehow shield her from further attention, from both Priscilla's suspicion and the king's increasingly obvious presence near the servant quarters. It did not work. 4 days after the confrontation in the passage, Elira was summoned unexpectedly to the king's private study, a request delivered by Captain Callum himself, who offered no explanation beyond stating that His Majesty required her presence regarding a matter of household management. Elira's hands trembled as she smoothed her simple dress, and followed Callum through corridors she had never before been permitted to enter, past guards who eyed her with open curiosity, until they reached a heavy wooden door that Callum knocked upon before stepping aside to allow her entry. The king's private study was smaller than Elira had expected, lined with shelves of worn books and maps of the surrounding territories, a fire crackling in the hearth despite the mild evening. Ronan stood near the window, his back to the door, though he turned the moment she entered, and something in his expression shifted the instant their eyes met, a mixture of relief and apprehension that Elira could not fully interpret. "Close the door, please," he said to Callum, who obeyed without question before retreating into the corridor beyond, leaving Elira alone with the king, for the first time since the drying yard weeks earlier. "Your Majesty," Elira said, bowing properly, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor. "Captain Ashford said, you required my presence regarding household matters." "There is no matter of household management," Ronan admitted, his voice quiet, almost pained. "I apologize for the deception, but I needed to speak with you privately, and I could think of no other reasonable pretext that would not draw unwanted attention." Elira's pulse quickened, uncertain whether to feel relief or renewed alarm. "What did you wish to discuss, Your Majesty?" He hesitated, running a hand through his dark hair, in a gesture that seemed entirely unlike the composed ruler she had known for 3 years. "Priscilla Vane approached me yesterday, with concerns regarding your conduct. She suggested you had made improper advances toward me, seeking to advance your position through manipulation." Elira's stomach dropped. "Your Majesty, I assure you, I have done nothing of the kind. I have performed my duties as always, and if my path has crossed yours more frequently of late, it was never by my own design." "I know," he said quickly, before she could continue defending herself further. "I know it was not your doing. If anything, the fault lies entirely with me, for I have found myself unable to keep the appropriate distance a king should maintain from those in his service." The admission hung in the air between them, and Elira found she could not breathe properly, could not think of any response that felt adequate to the moment. Ronan crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance away, though his eyes never left her face. "I owe you an explanation," he said quietly, "and perhaps an apology, for the position my own weakness has placed you in." "Your Majesty, you owe me nothing," Elira said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty over what exactly he was about to reveal. "I think perhaps I owe you a great deal," he said, and for the first time since she had known him, the composed mask he wore before the entire fortress slipped entirely away, revealing something raw and uncertain beneath, something that looked remarkably like fear. "3 years ago," Ronan began, his voice low and steady despite the tension evident in his frame. "You arrived at this fortress with nothing but a small bag and a grief you tried desperately to hide behind a straightened spine. I remember watching you from the tower window as the gate guards processed your arrival. I do not know why that particular moment stayed with me when I have witnessed hundreds of new servants arrive over the years, but it did, and it has never fully left me since." Elira stood frozen, unable to speak, watching as the king who had ruled with cold authority for as long as she had known him, laid himself bare before her, with an honesty that felt almost dangerous in its vulnerability. "I told myself it was simple admiration," he continued. "A king, noticing resilience in a new servant, nothing more significant than that. But my wolf did not agree with my careful reasoning. It began to notice you in ways that alarmed me. Small details, the particular rhythm of your laughter, the careful way you handled delicate fabric, the quiet dignity you carried, even while performing the most humble tasks in this fortress." "Your Majesty," Elira whispered, her voice barely audible. "The letters. I found them, hidden in the lining of your robe. I did not mean to intrude upon something so private, but once I had seen the first, I could not stop myself from reading further." Something like relief crossed his features, as though a burden he had carried alone for years had finally found somewhere to rest. "I suspected as much, that day in the steward's chamber. I saw the paper in your hand, and something in your expression told me you already understood far more than you were admitting." "I was afraid," Elira admitted. "Afraid of what it would mean if I was right about who they were written about, and afraid of what it would mean if I was wrong." "You were not wrong," he said simply, and the words landed between them with the weight of 3 years compressed into a single moment. "My wolf recognized its bond the day you arrived, though I refused to acknowledge it for a long time, believing a king could not afford such weakness. That duty required me to set aside personal desire for the good of this pack. I wrote those letters instead of speaking the truth aloud, hoping that confining my feelings to paper might somehow lessen their hold over me. It never worked." Elira felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, an overwhelming mixture of relief and fear, and something warmer she had not allowed herself to name until this very moment. "Your Majesty, I am only a laundress. The council will never accept such a bond, and Priscilla Vane has already made her intentions toward me quite clear should such a truth become known." "I am aware of the difficulties," Ronan said, his expression hardening slightly with resolve. "I have spent years hiding this truth, precisely because I understood how the council would react, how families like the Vanes would fight against any threat to the alliances they have spent generations cultivating. But I find I can no longer continue pretending my wolf's bond does not exist, simply because acknowledging it proves inconvenient to political calculations." "What are you saying?" Elira asked, hardly daring to hope for the answer she suspected was coming. "I am saying that I have been a coward for 3 years," he said, "hiding behind duty and political necessity, rather than facing the truth my wolf has known since the day you walked through that gate. I do not know yet how to navigate the difficulties such an acknowledgement will bring, the council's objections, the Vane family's anger, the danger it may place you in, but I know that continuing to hide is no longer something I am willing to do." Elira's heart raced with a dizzying mixture of joy and terror. "Your Majesty, if this becomes known, the danger will not be limited to political inconvenience. Lady Priscilla has already threatened me, subtly but unmistakably. If she learns her suspicions were correct all along, I fear what lengths she and her family might go to in order to protect their position." "I will not allow harm to come to you," Ronan said, his voice firm with an authority she had rarely heard directed toward matters outside official pack business. "Whatever challenges lie ahead, I will face them, but I needed you to know the truth first, needed you to understand that everything you found in that lining was real, was always about you, before I take any further steps that will affect both our lives so significantly." A knock sounded at the study door, sharp and urgent, interrupting whatever else Ronan might have said. Captain Callum's voice came through the heavy wood, tense with unusual urgency. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but Elder Magnus Thorne has arrived unannounced, demanding an immediate audience regarding matters he describes as urgent and deeply concerning to the stability of the pack. Ronan's expression shifted instantly back into the composed mask Illyra had known for 3 years, though his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer before he called out permission for Callum to enter. This conversation is not finished, he murmured quietly to Illyra, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. But it seems the council has already begun to sense that something has changed. The door opened, and Elder Magnus Thorne strode into the study, with the confident bearing of a man who had served on the pack council for decades, his weathered face set in lines of grave concern. His sharp eyes swept across the room, taking in Illyra's presence with obvious surprise, before settling on the king with pointed scrutiny. Your Majesty, Magnus said, his tone carrying the careful diplomacy of long practice, though tension lingered beneath his words. Lady Priscilla Vane has brought disturbing accusations before several council members this very evening, claims regarding improper conduct within your household staff. Given the timing of this private audience, I confess I find myself deeply concerned about what exactly is transpiring within these walls. Illyra felt the full weight of danger settle over the room like a physical presence, understanding immediately that whatever fragile privacy Ronan's admission had been spoken within, it had already been shattered by forces moving far faster than either of them had anticipated. Ronan's expression remained carefully neutral, though Illyra noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the tightening of his hands behind his back. Elder Thorne, whatever accusations Lady Priscilla has brought before the council, I assure you they stem from personal disappointment, rather than any genuine impropriety within this household. Personal disappointment can still illuminate genuine truths, Your Majesty, Magnus said carefully, his sharp eyes flicking once more toward Illyra, who stood silently near the window, uncertain whether she should attempt to leave or remain exactly where she was. The council has waited patiently for 2 years, while you deliberated over matters of succession. Lady Priscilla's accusations suggest your deliberation has not been born of careful consideration at all, but rather of an attachment the council was never informed of. And if that attachment exists, Ronan said slowly, choosing each word with evident care, would the council refuse to acknowledge a wolf's genuine bond, simply because it does not align with the political alliances certain families hope to secure? Magnus's expression flickered with something between surprise and cautious calculation. The council's role has always been to protect the stability of this pack, Your Majesty. A wolf's bond, however genuine, cannot always be permitted to override considerations of succession, security, and the alliances necessary to protect our borders from encroaching threats. Surely you understand this better than anyone, given the sacrifices your own father made in matters of the heart for the good of this pack. The mention of Ronan's father seemed to land heavily, and Illyra watched as something tightened in his expression, an old grief resurfacing briefly, before he mastered it once more. My father's sacrifices brought him no lasting peace, Elder Thorne. I have spent my entire reign watching the effects of a marriage built on political necessity, rather than genuine bonding, watching my mother wither in a union that gave her everything, except the one thing she truly desired. I will not repeat his mistakes simply because tradition demands it. Magnus studied the king for a long moment, then turned his attention fully toward Illyra, his gaze assessing rather than hostile, though no less unsettling for its directness. And you, young woman, what is your name? Illyra Hartwell, Elder Thorne, she answered, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coiling tightly in her stomach. Hartwell, Magnus repeated, something flickering briefly in his expression, a note of recognition that surprised Illyra. Your father was Edwin Hartwell, once elder of the Northern Territories before the border dispute stripped his family of standing. Yes, Elder Thorne, Illyra said, startled that he remembered her father's name at all, given how many years had passed since her family's exile. I remember your father well, Magnus said, his tone softening slightly, though his posture remained formal. He was a man of considerable integrity, unfairly punished for circumstances largely beyond his control during that border conflict. I always believed the council treated his family unjustly in the aftermath. This unexpected acknowledgement seemed to shift something in the room's tension, though Ronan's shoulders remained tight with wariness, unwilling to trust that this conversation might resolve favorably, simply because Magnus had spoken kindly of Illyra's father. Elder Thorne, Ronan said carefully, regardless of Miss Hartwell's family history, the matter at hand concerns whether the council will accept my wolf's genuine bond, or whether political considerations will be permitted to override it entirely. That is not a decision I can make alone, Your Majesty, Magnus said, straightening his posture once more. The full council must convene to discuss such a significant matter, particularly given the accusations Lady Priscilla has already raised publicly this very evening. I would advise you to prepare carefully for what will likely become a contentious gathering. And Miss Hartwell's safety in the meantime? Ronan pressed, his voice carrying an edge of protective urgency that Alira had never heard him direct toward anyone before. The Vane family has already made subtle threats against her. I will not permit her to face retaliation while the council deliberates over matters entirely beyond her control. Magnus considered this for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. I will speak with Osric Vane personally regarding appropriate conduct while this matter remains unresolved. Beyond that, Your Majesty, I would suggest you consider carefully how you wish to present this situation before the full council. For whatever affection exists between yourself and Miss Hartwell, the pack's stability ultimately depends on maintaining order and trust in its leadership. After Magnus departed, the study fell into heavy silence, Alira and Ronan standing several paces apart, the weight of everything spoken and everything still unspoken pressing down upon them both. Finally, Ronan crossed the distance between them, stopping close enough that Alira could see the genuine worry etched into his features. I am sorry, he said quietly. I never intended for you to become entangled in council politics and Vane family schemes. This danger exists entirely because of my own inability to acknowledge the truth sooner. You cannot control what your wolf feels, Your Majesty, Alira said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice despite the fear still coursing through her. Nor can I claim regret over discovering those letters, however dangerous the truth they revealed has proven to be. Something softened in his expression at her words, a fragile hope emerging beneath the worry. Whatever the council decides in the coming days, know that I do not intend to abandon this truth simply because it proves politically inconvenient. My father chose duty over genuine connection, and I have watched that choice hollow out an entire family for decades. I will not make the same mistake. Alira left the study that evening with her mind and heart in turmoil, uncertain what the coming days would bring, but no longer able to deny the truth that had settled deep within her own chest. Whatever danger lay ahead, whatever the council ultimately decided, she found she could not regret the moment 3 weeks earlier, when curious fingers had discovered a hidden seam in a king's ceremonial robe. News of the council's impending gathering spread through the fortress within a single day, carried by whispers between servants who sensed the shifting currents of power long before any official announcement reached them. Alira felt the change in how people looked at her, some with curiosity, others with open suspicion, a few kitchen maids offering small, sympathetic smiles that suggested word of her family's history had begun circulating alongside speculation about her connection to the king. Nora, upon finally hearing fragments of the truth from fortress gossip rather than from Alira directly, confronted her friend with a mixture of hurt and concern. You could have told me, Nora said quietly one evening as they prepared for bed. 3 years of friendship, and you kept something this significant hidden from me. I was afraid, Alira admitted, guilt weighing heavily on her chest. Afraid of how dangerous the truth might become if it spread too quickly, and afraid of dragging you into difficulties that were never yours to carry. Nora's expression softened, though her hurt remained visible. I would have kept your confidence, Alira, but I understand fear makes us do strange things to protect those we care about. Just promise me you will not face whatever comes next entirely alone. I promise, Alira said, grateful beyond words for her friend's forgiveness, though she suspected the coming days would test that promise more severely than either of them yet understood. 2 days before the council was scheduled to convene, Osric Vane summoned Alira to his chambers under the pretense of discussing household inventory matters. She arrived cautiously, aware that Elder Magnus had promised to speak with him regarding appropriate conduct, though she held little faith that such a conversation would fully neutralize whatever scheme the Vane family had already set into motion. Osric's chambers were richly furnished, a stark contrast to the modest quarters Alira shared with Nora, and he did not bother rising from his desk when she entered, merely gesturing toward a chair she did not sit in, preferring to remain standing. Miss Hartwell, Osric began, his tone carrying false cordiality, that did not reach his calculating eyes. I understand you have found yourself unexpectedly entangled in matters far above your station. I have done nothing improper, Master Vane, Illyra replied evenly, refusing to let her voice betray the anxiety twisting through her stomach. Perhaps not, Osric conceded, though his tone suggested he believed otherwise entirely. Yet intentions matter little when consequences threaten the stability my family has worked generations to secure. My daughter has waited patiently for the king's formal declaration, sacrificing considerable personal happiness in service to an alliance that would strengthen our eastern borders against growing threats from rival pacts. I will not allow a servant's unexpected fortune to undo years of careful diplomacy. I have sought no fortune, Master Vane, Illyra said. Whatever bond exists between myself and His Majesty developed entirely without my design or encouragement. Design matters little to those observing from outside, Osric said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man accustomed to bending situations toward his own advantage. I have already begun quiet conversations with several council members regarding your family's history, the unfortunate circumstances surrounding your father's exile from the Northern Territories. Such history could easily be reframed as evidence of instability, of a bloodline unsuited to royal connection. Illyra's chest tightened with anger at hearing her father's memory used as a weapon against her, though she forced herself to remain composed. My father's exile resulted from a border conflict beyond his control, a fact Elder Magnus Thorn himself acknowledged only days ago. Elder Thorn holds only one voice among many on the council, Osric said dismissively. Other members may prove considerably less sentimental about matters of proper lineage and bloodline stability. I would advise you, Miss Hartwell, to consider carefully whether pursuing this connection with the king serves your own best interests, or whether a quiet withdrawal, perhaps a transfer to a distant territory with generous compensation, might prove far wiser for someone in your position. The threat, though wrapped in the language of gentle advice, could not have been clearer. Illyra understood she was being offered a choice between voluntary exile with some measure of dignity intact, or a fight that Osric intended to make as painful and public as possible, should she refuse his suggestion. I appreciate your concern for my well-being, Master Vane, Illyra said carefully, but the choice of whether to pursue any connection with His Majesty belongs to him and to me alone, not to the political calculations of families hoping to secure advantageous alliances. Osric's expression hardened at her refusal, though he maintained his composed facade. Very well, Miss Hartwell. I had hoped to spare you unnecessary difficulty, but if you insist on remaining entangled in matters beyond your station, you will find the coming council session considerably less pleasant than you might hope. Illyra left his chambers with her hands trembling, though her resolve had only strengthened despite the clear threat. She made her way toward the fortress gardens, needing air and space to steady her racing thoughts, and found Captain Callum waiting near the entrance, his expression grave. I heard about your meeting with Master Vane, Callum said quietly, falling into step beside her as she walked. Word travels quickly within these walls, particularly regarding matters the Vane family wishes to control. He threatened me, Captain, Illyra admitted, not directly, but clearly enough that I understood his meaning. Callum's jaw tightened. The Vane family has held considerable influence over the Eastern Council seats for 3 generations. They will not surrender that influence without a significant fight, particularly not to someone they consider an unworthy replacement for Lady Priscilla. Do you believe the council will side with them? Illyra asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice entirely. Callum considered the question carefully before answering. The council is not unified, Miss Hartwell. Elder Thorn has long harbored concerns about the Vane family's growing influence, viewing it as a potential threat to the balance of power among the territories. There are others who share similar concerns, though whether their numbers prove sufficient to counter Osric Vane's political maneuvering remains uncertain. And His Majesty? Illyra asked quietly. What will happen to him if the council refuses to accept this bond? Callum's expression grew troubled. I have served King Ronan since before he took the throne, Miss Hartwell. I have never seen him fight for anything, with the determination he has shown these past weeks regarding you. Whatever the council decides, I do not believe he intends to simply accept defeat quietly. That evening, Illyra received an unexpected visitor at her shared quarters, a young council page delivering a sealed letter bearing the royal insignia. Inside, written in Ronan's familiar uneven hand, was a brief message asking her to meet him in the fortress gardens after moonrise, when the council chambers would be empty and prying eyes less likely to observe their meeting. Illyra arrived at the appointed time to find Ronan waiting beneath the old oak tree that marked the garden's center, his expression carrying both determination and worry in equal measure. "Osric Vane has been busy," he said, without preamble, once she had crossed the distance between them. "I have received word that he intends to bring formal accusations against your family's history before the full council tomorrow, hoping to poison their opinion before any genuine discussion of our bond can occur." "I am aware," Illyra said. "He made his intentions quite clear during our meeting this afternoon." Ronan's expression darkened with barely controlled anger. "He approached you directly? I had hoped Magnus's intervention would prevent such tactics, at least temporarily." "He offered me a choice," Illyra said quietly. "Quiet withdrawal with compensation, or a fight he promised to make considerably unpleasant should I refuse." "And what did you tell him?" Ronan asked, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "I told him the choice belonged to us, not to his political calculations," Illyra said, meeting his gaze steadily, despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest. Something fierce and grateful crossed Ronan's features at her answer. "Then we face tomorrow's council together, whatever the outcome may bring. I have spent 3 years hiding behind duty and fear of political consequence. I will not spend a single day longer pretending this bond does not exist, regardless of what Osric Vane or anyone else attempts to construct against us." The council chamber had never felt so vast as it did the following morning, its high stone walls and long polished table lined with elders whose expressions ranged from open hostility to cautious curiosity. Illyra stood near the entrance beside Captain Callum, her hands clasped tightly together to still their trembling, while Ronan took his place at the head of the table, his posture radiating a calm authority that gave no hint of the tension she knew coiled tightly beneath his composed exterior. Osric Vane rose first, as expected, his voice carrying easily across the chamber. "Elders of this council, I bring before you a matter of grave concern regarding the stability of succession within our pack. It has come to my attention that His Majesty has formed an inappropriate attachment to a member of his household staff, a laundress whose family history includes exile from the Northern Territories, under circumstances that raise significant questions about loyalty and stability." Murmurs rippled through the assembled elders, several exchanging glances that suggested Osric's words had already found fertile ground among those inclined toward suspicion. Illyra felt her stomach tighten, though she kept her expression as steady as she could manage, remembering her mother's words about courage and truth. "Furthermore," Osric continued, clearly emboldened by the reaction his opening remarks had produced, "my own daughter, Lady Priscilla, has patiently awaited formal recognition, as His Majesty's intended for 2 years, an arrangement that would secure vital alliances along our vulnerable eastern borders. To abandon such a strategically crucial alliance for an unproven attachment to a servant of questionable lineage would represent a reckless disregard for this pack's security." Elder Magnus rose then, his weathered voice cutting through the chamber with measured authority. "Master Vane speaks of strategic alliances, yet I would remind this council that Edwin Hartwell, father of the young woman in question, served this pack with considerable honor, before circumstances beyond his control led to his family's unjust exile. I have reviewed the records of that border conflict myself in recent days, and I find no evidence whatsoever of disloyalty on his part, merely the unfortunate consequences of a conflict he did not initiate." More murmurs followed this correction, though Osric's expression remained unmoved, clearly prepared for such counter-arguments. "Regardless of the father's history, Elder Thorn, the fact remains that a wolf's mate must bring stability and appropriate connections to the throne, qualities a laundress simply cannot provide, regardless of any personal charm she may possess." Ronan rose then, and the chamber fell silent as every eye turned toward the king. "Elders," he began, his voice carrying the weight of genuine conviction rather than mere formal address, "I have sat quietly, through years of council deliberation, regarding my eventual mate, weighing political calculations against my own wolf's instincts, believing duty required me to prioritize alliance over genuine bonding. I have watched the effects of such a choice destroy my own parents' happiness, my mother withering in a marriage built entirely on political necessity rather than authentic connection." He paused, his gaze finding Illyra across the chamber before continuing. 3 years ago, My wolf recognized its bond the moment Alira Hartwell crossed through this fortress's gate. I have spent every day since fighting against that recognition, believing my position demanded such denial. I was wrong. A wolf spawn does not form according to political convenience, and continuing to deny its truth serves no one, least of all this pack whose stability I am sworn to protect. Your Majesty, Osric interjected sharply, sentiment cannot override strategic necessity. The eastern borders require the alliance my family's connections would provide. Then let us discuss strategic necessity honestly, Master Vane, Ronan said, his tone sharpening with an authority Alira had rarely witnessed him direct at anyone within these walls. You claim the Eastern Alliance vital to our security, yet I have reviewed our border reports extensively over recent months. The threats you describe have diminished considerably since the treaty negotiations concluded 2 years past. Perhaps your urgency regarding this alliance stems less from genuine strategic necessity and more from personal ambition regarding your family's influence within this council. The accusation landed heavily, and several elders shifted uncomfortably, clearly recalculating their positions in light of this pointed observation. Osric's face flushed with barely restrained anger, though he said nothing immediately, apparently unprepared for such a direct challenge to his motivations. Elder Magnus spoke again into the tense silence. Your Majesty raises a fair point regarding the current state of our eastern borders. I would suggest this council consider the matter of the King's Mate on its own merits, separate from any strategic alliance considerations that may no longer carry the urgency once claimed. Several other elders nodded in cautious agreement, and Alira felt a small flicker of hope begin to grow amid the tension still gripping the chamber. Ronan turned to address the full council once more, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. I stand before you today, not as a king deliberating political strategy, but as a man acknowledging a truth I have hidden for far too long, out of fear and misplaced duty. My wolf has chosen Alira Hartwell as its mate, and I intend to honor that choice openly, regardless of whatever objections this council may raise. I ask not for your permission, elders, for a wolf's bond requires none. I ask instead for your wisdom in helping this pack navigate whatever transition such an acknowledgement brings, so that we may move forward with unity, rather than division. The chamber remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the king's words settling over the assembled elders. Finally, an older woman near the end of the table, whom Alira recognized as Elder Sorcha Bellamy, rose slowly to her feet. Your Majesty, Sorcha said, her voice carrying quiet dignity. I have served on this council for over 30 years, and in that time, I have watched too many unions built on political calculation, rather than genuine bonding. Unions that ultimately weakened, rather than strengthened this pack, through the resentment and unhappiness they created. If your wolf has truly chosen this young woman, I for one am inclined to trust that instinct over any manufactured urgency regarding Eastern alliances that may no longer reflect our actual circumstances. More elders began murmuring their agreement, and Alira watched as the tide within the chamber slowly shifted, though Osric Vane's expression remained thunderous, clearly unwilling to accept defeat so easily despite the council's evident shift in sentiment. This council will require time to properly discuss the matter, Osric said stiffly, attempting one final effort to delay the proceedings. Such a significant decision cannot be rushed through hasty sentiment. Then let us discuss it properly, Master Vane, Elder Magnus said calmly. But let us discuss it based on genuine merit, rather than manufactured strategic urgency, designed to serve a single family's ambitions. The council session stretched on for hours after that, elders debating the implications of the king's declaration, questioning Alira directly about her family's history, her character, her understanding of the responsibilities such a position would demand of her. She answered each question as honestly and steadily as she could manage, drawing on her mother's quiet strength and her own 3 years of careful, dignified service within these very walls. By the time the sun began setting outside the tall chamber windows, the council had not yet reached a final decision, though the balance of sentiment had shifted considerably from where it stood at the morning's opening. Alira left the chamber that evening, exhausted but not defeated, aware that the fight for recognition had only truly begun, yet grateful beyond measure that Ronan had chosen, finally and fully, to stand beside her, rather than continue hiding behind years of careful political silence. 3 days passed before the council reached its final decision. 3 days during which Alira continued her duties in the laundry hall despite the whirlwind surrounding her life, finding a strange comfort in the familiar rhythm of washing and folding, while her future hung suspended in uncertainty. Nora remained steadily by her side throughout, offering quiet encouragement whenever fear threatened to overwhelm her, and even several kitchen staff who had once barely acknowledged Alira's presence began offering small gestures of support, a warm meal set aside, an encouraging word exchanged in passing hallways. Priscilla Vane made no further direct threats during those tense days, though Alira occasionally caught sight of her across the courtyard, her expression carrying a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like resignation, as though she had begun to accept that her father's ambitions for her might not reach fruition after all. On the third evening, Captain Callum arrived at the laundry hall with an official summons, his expression carrying a cautious optimism that Alira dared not fully trust until she heard the council's decision spoken aloud. She followed him through the familiar corridors toward the council chamber, her heart hammering with equal parts hope and dread. The chamber was fuller than she had seen it during the previous session, word of the impending decision having drawn additional observers, minor nobility, and senior household staff crowding along the chamber's edges to witness whatever announcement the council intended to make. Ronan stood near the head of the table, his eyes finding hers the moment she entered, and something in his steady gaze helped calm the frantic racing of her pulse. Elder Magnus rose to address the gathered crowd, his weathered voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber. After considerable deliberation, this council has reached its decision regarding the matter of His Majesty's chosen mate. We have examined the history of Alira Hartwell's family, confirmed through careful review of border conflict records that no disloyalty existed in her father's past actions, merely the unfortunate consequences of circumstances beyond his control. He paused, letting his words settle over the assembled crowd before continuing. We have also examined the current state of our eastern borders, and confirmed His Majesty's assertion that the strategic urgency once claimed regarding an alliance with the Vane family no longer reflects genuine necessity, given the successful resolution of previous border tensions through diplomatic channels established over the past 2 years. Osric Vane's face remained tight with barely controlled frustration, though he said nothing, apparently having exhausted whatever arguments he had hoped to bring against the council's evident direction. Therefore, Magnus continued, this council formally recognizes the bond between King Ronan Blackthorn and Alira Hartwell as legitimate and worthy of the throne's blessing. We further acknowledge that a wolf's genuine bond, when confirmed through careful examination rather than hasty sentiment alone, serves this pack's long-term stability far better than alliances built solely on political calculation. A wave of murmured reaction swept through the chamber, some elders nodding with evident approval, others exchanging surprised glances, though the overall sentiment appeared to lean strongly in favor of the council's decision. Alira felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, relief and joy overwhelming the fear she had carried for so many days. Ronan crossed the chamber floor toward her without hesitation, his expression open with a warmth she had rarely seen him display before the full council's watching eyes. It seems, he said quietly, though his voice carried enough for those nearby to hear, that my wolf's choice has finally received the recognition it deserved from the very beginning. Your Majesty, Alira began, still struggling to fully absorb the weight of what had just occurred, but he shook his head gently, interrupting her formal address. Ronan, he said softly, after everything we have endured these past weeks together, I believe you have earned the right to simply call me by my name. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparation and adjustment, as Alira transitioned from her humble quarters in the servants' wing toward chambers befitting the king's intended mate, a transition that felt at times overwhelming, though Nora remained close by throughout, helping her navigate unfamiliar customs and expectations with the same patient guidance she had once offered while teaching Alira the proper handling of delicate fabrics. Marla Hartwell, upon learning of her daughter's remarkable change in fortune, wept with joy that Alira had rarely witnessed from her typically composed mother, declaring that Edwin would have been immeasurably proud to see his daughter's dignity finally recognized by the very pack that had once cast their family aside. The formal ceremony took place on a clear autumn morning, the fortress courtyard decorated with banners bearing the blackthorn crest, alongside simple wildflowers Alira had specifically requested, a small nod to the humble beginnings she never wished to forget despite her new position. Elder Magnus presided over the ceremony himself, his weathered voice carrying the traditional words of pack bonding with evident sincerity, while Elder Sorcha Bellamy stood nearby, her earlier support having proven instrumental in swaying the council's final decision. Priscilla Vane did not attend the ceremony, having quietly departed the fortress weeks earlier for an extended visit to distant relatives, though Osric remained, his expression carefully neutral throughout the proceedings, evidently having accepted the political reality that further resistance would only diminish his family's remaining influence within the council. As Ronan slipped the traditional silver band onto Alira's finger before the assembled crowd, she found her thoughts drifting back to that fateful afternoon weeks earlier, when curious fingers had discovered a small ridge in a hidden lining, a moment that had seemed so insignificant at the time, yet had ultimately unraveled years of carefully guarded secrets and fears. "I still have the letters," Ronan murmured to her quietly, as the ceremony concluded, and the gathered crowd began their celebration. "Every single one, safely stored now, rather than hidden away in fear." "Perhaps," Alira said, smiling despite the tears gathering in her eyes, "we might read them together someday, now that there is no longer any need for secrecy between us." "I would like that very much," Ronan said, drawing her close as the autumn sun bathed the courtyard in warm golden light. The fortress that had once felt so vast and unwelcoming to a grieving 16-year-old, now finally, truly, feeling like home. Their bond, once hidden within the careful stitching of a ceremonial robe, now stood openly acknowledged before the entire pack. A wolf's chosen mate finally recognized not through political calculation, but through the simple, undeniable truth that love, however inconvenient its timing or origin, could not forever be confined to paper and hidden seams.